Good afternoon, and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm John Colm, president of WireNet. WireNet's an economic development organization that strengthens manufacturing. We bring company leaders together to find solutions to help their companies grow. With over 300 member companies that employ 18,000 people, our members are an economic force in their own right. But regionally, manufacturing is even more important. Across Northeast Ohio, almost 6,900 firms employ 257 people here. These firms are diverse. They include almost every industry and serve almost any market that you can imagine, from basic metals, chemicals, automotive, and automation equipment, to new and old energy markets like wind and natural gas. As the old saying goes, Pittsburgh is steel, Detroit's automotive, and Cleveland is everything in between. Well, to celebrate WireNet's 25th anniversary this year, we're really excited to introduce you to the Alliance for American Manufacturing. The Alliance is here to talk with us about the emerging issues that will affect the future of American manufacturing and which are detailed in their newest book, ReMaking America. I want to invite all of you at the City Club of Cleveland here today to join us after today's forum for a roundtable discussion with some of the authors. And this roundtable reception is sponsored by our colleagues at Magnet. I also want to extend an invitation to you to join us on October 24th for WireNet's 25th anniversary Nuts and Bolts Bash at the House of Blues in Cleveland. This is a great social and networking event that proves that manufacturing rocks. So today's moderator is Scott Paul, the president of the Alliance for American Manufacturing, a coalition formed in 2007 by leading American manufacturers and the United Steelworkers. The Alliance's current priorities include promoting strong Buy American policies, advocating for fair trade, and promoting a long-term national manufacturing strategy. Mr. Paul has worked on the legislative staff of the AFL-CIO and in several positions on Capitol Hill. He has a BA in Foreign Service from Penn State and a Master's in Security Studies from Georgetown. And he was raised in Rensselaer, Indiana, but now lives in Silver Spring with his wife and two twin boys. Please give a warm welcome to Scott Paul.
Thank you, John. I want to thank you, WireNet, and Magnet for your generous sponsorship and partnership. It's an honor to be at the City Club, the citadel of free speech, to talk about an issue that's obviously near and dear to our hearts, but is obviously critically important to the city of Cleveland and the outlying area as well. I do want to thank the Alliance's stakeholders for making our work possible, and our stakeholders also have a deep and strong tradition in and around Cleveland. The United Steelworkers, ArcelorMittal, Cliffs Natural Resources, and many others. I will say that the views in the book are exclusively of the authors and don't necessarily represent the views of any of the sponsoring organizations, and that goes for my chapter as well. I write a bit about manufacturing policy and the types of policies we need from the federal and state levels to be successful in the coming century in manufacturing if we're to regain our lead. It's my honor to be joined by three of the other authors of this book, and there are 10 chapters in total. If you're listening, you can find more information about it at ReMakingAmericaBook.com, and would encourage you to take a look at that. Seated next to me is Dr. Sridhar Kota, who is a professor of mechanical engineering at the University of Michigan. He's also an inventor and business owner. And before he returned to the University of Michigan, Sridhar directed the Obama administration's advanced manufacturing policy in the Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House. Seated next to Dr. Kota is Dr. Irene Petrick. Dr. Petrick is a professor at Penn State's College of Information Sciences and Technology. She is also the managing director of Trendscape Innovation Group, and she is a returning author for AAM, having also penned a chapter in our 2009 book. And finally, seated next to Dr. Petrick is Carl Pope. And Carl Pope is the former executive director of the Sierra Club, which is America's most prominent environmental group. Carl is a strategist, a gifted writer, and a coalition builder, able to build alliances around renewable energy among businesses, labor, and the environmental environmental organizations. Not surprisingly, Carl wrote about energy. Dr. Petrick wrote about technology trends, and Dr. Kota wrote about innovation. And I wanted to start the conversation off and localize it a little bit, because I don't have to tell you the importance of manufacturing to Cleveland's economy, but it may surprise you to know, or it may not, that Cleveland's also the epicenter of the politics of manufacturing. There was no media market in America that experienced more political ads in the last election on the topics of jobs, manufacturing, outsourcing, and trade than Cleveland. In fact, if you lived here, you were exposed to a total of 49,000 different television ads aired by both Democrats and Republicans covering these topics. I'm certain that doesn't surprise any of you who are watching television in last September or October. It's also an epicenter for innovation and for political figures who have talked and who have done something about manufacturing as well. And so one of the things that I thought would be interesting, is particularly to the small and mid-sized manufacturers, would be to start with Dr. Petrick and ask Irene, what are your chapter doesn't cover policy, kind of mercifully for some of us, but it does talk about some pretty shocking predictions and trends, and I'm hoping you can share those with us, and then what they mean to some of the small and mid-sized manufacturers in the audience.
Sure, thank you, Scott. The three major trends that I talk about, not surprisingly, are based around information technology. The first really is that a lot of cloud-based services are going to be available that will take what have been very expensive ERP and other kinds of systems and put them in the hands of individuals who can basically, what we call snack. I can download things by the millisecond, and so I'm not buying these very expensive systems. And that changes the competitive dynamics of how I bid contracts and how I do logistics and a lot of other things. The second prediction that I've made that is based on trends that we see is that high-speed and high-performance computing is going to get to the masses. Right now it is the purview of companies like Boeing and Honeywell and very large companies that are doing a lot of simulations. If I can think about something and imagine it, and if I can simulate it, before I ever cut metal or do anything else, then I have a lot more power in my hands as an individual. And that then leads me to the third prediction that I've made, and it's really already, we talked about it being over the horizon, but it's really on the horizon now, and that's 3D manufacturing, called 3D printing, called additive manufacturing. The hype is pretty extensive right now, but in plastics at least, the hype is actually pretty correct. In metals, it's not quite here yet, but in the next decade, those three things coming together, combined with some really internet-savvy hobbyists, are going to change what we describe as a manufacturer. And I think we're going to see competition from sources we don't normally expect. And because, if you think of a printer as the ultimate fax machine, then I can make things locally that have been made globally. And I think that's a really important implication.
I think it is as well. I want to ask Sridhar, because there's a policy component to this in enabling this type of technology to get to the small and mid-sized manufacturers. And I know you worked on this at the White House, but could you talk a bit about some of the partnerships that you saw to help bring this online?
Yeah, I think Irene pointed out very correctly about how the simulation tools that have been around actually for 20, 30 years at large companies like Boeing and Honeywell and what have you, they have access to, because as many of you know, you can do the design and development and testing everything virtually before you touch any metal. But we have 300,000 small and medium-sized manufacturers, and a vast majority of them, over 85% of them, even today, don't use modeling and simulation tools for two simple reasons: cost and expertise. They're very expensive, and they don't have the expertise. So one of the policy programs we put in place through the White House and the Department of Commerce is to okay, how do we lower those two barriers? So this is reducing the cost barrier by putting these tools on the cloud. Actually, Ohio Supercomputing Institute, Supercomputing Center is a fantastic facility, great people there. They provided the computational cycles, and we had students from Purdue University, and using their cyber infrastructure, they provided the expertise. So we had P&G, Lockheed, Boeing, GE, and John Deere came together to, I mean, they have all the tools, but they want their suppliers and the lower tier suppliers to move up the learning curve. So this was put in place within 18 months. We had close to 30 companies coming up with new businesses. Just a simple example, Jacko Plastics in Indiana. They were a small company of 25 people making small plastic parts, and they had an opportunity to bid on a huge plastic pallet for a large German OEM. Through this program, they were able to bid and win that contract. It's a huge multi-million-dollar contract. So today, Jacko produces those parts that used to be made in China just less than 2 years ago. And there are many other stories like that in Ohio and Indiana that came out. So this is actually what Irene talked about, the cloud computing and lowering the barriers, democratizing the use of these tools is really, that's one way we can enhance competitiveness of our small and medium-sized manufacturers.
Thank you, Sridhar. And Carl, I know that you've been to Cleveland. In fact, you've spoken at this club several times about this and related themes. But one of the important partnerships that you helped to develop sort of sprung up from Cleveland, and we saw the wind turbine last night at the Great Lakes Science Center. But talk to me about some of the potential for Cleveland for renewable energy manufacturing, and also what it's going to take to both bring it to scale and to make it a reality.
Well, it's a good news, bad news story. The technology for modern wind turbines was developed in Sandusky, Ohio, not very far from here. But 5 years ago, I was in the port of Duluth, and Duluth had just begun to import wind turbines, as well as exporting taconite ore. And what was happening was they were importing wind turbines from Denmark and exporting taconite ore to China. Now, both of those products went by Cleveland on the way. And they went by a number of other cities where you could have turned taconite into a wind turbine. There was no lack of technical expertise. There was no lack of manufacturing capacity. What there was a lack of was a supportive government consistency in policy. And then we made some investments in renewable energy. President Obama came in, and 3 years ago, they started making wind turbine blades in Grand Forks, North Dakota, from parts manufactured in part here in Ohio, and exporting them to Brazil. So that was a success story. Only then we decided, well, we have this political gridlock in Washington, so we're going to sit around and not tell people what the investment and tax rules are for wind manufacturing, and that plant in Grand Forks was shut down a year ago. So we have to recognize that the opportunity that Sridhar and Irene are talking about is right here. It's in our lap. We invent the stuff. We create the ideas which will make the world of the future. But it is not certain that we will actually do it here, because we can't seem to decide as a nation that it's important to us. Everything else seems to be more important in Washington than America's manufacturing base. And if that's going to change, I think this city has more at stake, probably, than any other place in the country.
And we know, and I know the Alliance has conducted a lot of survey research that indicates voters of all stripes support manufacturing and actually support very bold policies. So it's not a lack of voter will, but translating that into policy has been one of the challenges, and we outlined some ideas in the book to get at that. But one of the things we have to overcome is this myth-making, I think, surrounding manufacturing and what's really holding it back, or what's really needed to move it forward. And it even goes down into the data and to the cost structure. But talk a bit about what you think is the biggest myth out there and I'm going to start with Sridhar and ask all of you, what's the biggest myth that you think you bust in your chapter? And talk about a few others if you want as well. Sridhar?
A couple of things. One is some economists will say how we're going to compete with the $1 an hour wages in China. The point I want to make is that it's especially when it comes to high-tech products. See, our competitive advantage in this country is in high-tech products, high productivity, high skills. It's not about who makes T-shirts and shoes. It's about high technology products. And if you look at that, let's not compare ourselves to China, compare ourselves to Germany. Germany has 30 to 40% higher wages. Their energy costs are higher, their pollution abatement costs are higher, and their taxes, marginal tax rate is slightly lower, but of course we'll get to that, how many companies actually pay 35%, that's a different point. So if you compare ourselves to Germany, we spend 6 times as much as Germany does in R&D, and they had, a year ago, $200 billion surplus in manufacturing, and we had $800 billion deficit. It's a $1 trillion difference. So the idea that the labor cost is what is, we are losing market share is totally wrong.
Right, because obviously in Germany, which has a strong union presence, thick regulation, a very green economy, and high wages, manufacturing as a percentage of GDP, I think, is 23%, and it's not even half that. Right. It's about half that in the United States. Irene, what myth
you took the easy one, by the way.
what myth are you busting?
Yeah. I think the myth that I would like to bust is that innovation really happens only at the really big, technically savvy companies. Certainly my research work suggests that it's really a combination of collaboration across the ecosystem. And I think beat that additive manufacturing 3D printing thing again. I think the way we describe manufacturing now as a dirty, male-dominated, very highly capital-intensive, I think is going to be only part of the story in the future.
And Carl, for you, what is the biggest myth that needs to be busted?
Well, I actually think the biggest myth is the Chinese wage. But the other myth that hasn't been mentioned is that you can separate innovation and manufacturing. Yeah. And that somehow, just because the factories of the future will not look like the River Rouge plant or the old U.S. steel mill in Cleveland. They won't look that way and they won't employ as many people. But those factories are still the essential linchpin from which ideas move from the laboratory to the consumer. And if you don't have the factory, you can't drive the innovation. We're already seeing this. The U.S. edge in solar technology is fading because the Chinese have created larger markets for solar panels than the United States. The next generation of wind turbines will not come from American-owned companies, even though wind turbines were invented in Sandusky, because we allowed the market for wind turbines to go to Europe. We have to understand that innovation, productivity, and manufacturing are a package. And you can't throw one of them away and keep the package. But that's what Washington has tried to do. And incidentally, that is what Washington is getting ready to do again, because the United States is about to sit down and negotiate very important trade agreements with our true competitors, which are Germany and Japan. And I will make a very strong prediction that Germany and Japan will come to those negotiating tables to protect their manufacturing base, and we will go to those negotiating tables to protect our banks.
And that has been a consistent policy, would you say, among Democrats and Republicans, to be fair about this over the last couple of decades?
The Clinton administration was the first administration to do it. The Bush administration piled on, and Obama has only made a slight tweak in the other direction.
I think one of the myths that I think needs to be busted is the idea that it's the image of manufacturing that's holding it back, particularly for young people getting engaged. And we actually did focus groups and some survey research, and we found that really the biggest barrier of entry to manufacturing was the notion that I want a 4-year college degree. And obviously that can be answered through programs like Sridhar's or Irene's at Michigan or Penn State or any school in Ohio. But beyond that, the young people, they could really care less about what a factory looks like. They could care less about, they actually get a huge amount of satisfaction about working with their hands and seeing that sort of accomplishment. The biggest barrier was the fact that they didn't think those jobs would be there. They didn't think those jobs would be there, and they experienced a generation of enormous downsizing in manufacturing, where we lost a third of all manufacturing jobs in the 2000s. We had a net loss of 55,000 manufacturing facilities in the 2000s. And so obviously their point of reference is a terrible one. But if they thought that the manufacturing jobs were going to be there, they'd want to go out and seek that. And obviously you have to build the pipeline and do lots of other things to make that possible. But it's clear that needs some public policy support to make it right, because it sounds like Germany has some policies, China has some policies that we don't want to imitate, that are mercantilist, but our competitors have a policy. What do we need to do to get our house in order? What's the most important thing that we need to do policy-wise, either from your expertise or what you see out there as well? Carl?
Well, I'd start out saying we have to understand we have to create markets. We have to make sure the markets are open to new innovators. We have what people in my part of the country like to call incumbent capitalism, where we basically make it very difficult for new companies or new processes to get into the marketplace. We slow them down with all kinds of layers of inadequate access to capital, poor supply chains, uncertain policies. I spent 4 hours in India 6 years ago trying to persuade an Indian wind company to build a manufacturing facility in the United States. And at the end of making my pitch, the vice president of the company, it was Suzlon Enterprises for business development, looked at me and said, "Mr. Pope, can you tell me what the tax policies for wind turbines are going to be in the United States in 5 years?" And I had to sit there silent. And he said, "When I build a factory in Europe, I know what the rules are. When I build a factory in China, I know what the rules are. When I build a factory even here in formerly socialist India, I know what the rules are. When you can tell me what the rules are going to be in the United States, I'll consider opening a factory." We need policy certainty. We need to put manufacturing at the top of our list. Not quite. Until 2 years ago, it had been 10 years since a silicon fabrication factory had been built in the United States. The last one to be considered was going to be built in Long Island. The company had bought the land, hired the architects, gotten their permits, optioned the machinery, and they went to the County Board of Supervisors to check one last thing, which was the water supply, because silicon manufacturing takes a lot of water. They said, "Where are we in a drought? Where are we in the queue for water in a drought?" And the answer was, "You're just behind the golf courses, because they were here first." It's the "they were here first" problem that we got to fix in this country.
You know, I'll take a little bit of disagreement there and say that I think the whole perception that manufacturing only happens in big factories is a myth. That in itself deserves some busting, because I think that there, and a lot of small to medium-sized companies, particularly smalls, are doing a lot of manufacturing on very small footprints,
Yeah, I
and
agree.
additive
I
is going to
agree
make
with
that even more.
No, I agree with you. I agree with you.
I think there's there's two tiers there that ought to.
But I think even the small manufacturers are going to need policy certainty. They're going to need to know if their markets are going to be there. They're going to need to know what the tax rules are. I think small companies actually are more disadvantaged by an uncertain policy environment because they can't afford lawyers.
Sridhar, from your post, what do you see?
Yeah, and just want to continue that, and they'll also end up paying higher taxes. We know some of the large companies don't pay as much as they should. But the policy uncertainty is the right thing. The other thing is, you know, in the last 34 years, if you look at all the technologies that we invented, we are such an innovative country, but hardly any of them are manufactured. We are creating knowledge, but not wealth. So the first thing to do is to stop the bleeding in terms of the next big thing that we are investing in. And not just invest in basic research, but also nurture it and create the industrial commerce and knowledge and infrastructure and skills, so that manufacturing is going to be anchored in this country. Otherwise, the idea of invent here, manufacture there, as we all know by now, is simply not economically sustainable.
And so I think one of the points is that, innovation is a good thing. Like having wind energy is a good thing. Having 3D printing is a good thing. Having MP3 players is a good thing. But it's only really a great thing if we have policies to incentivize making it here as well, so that the wind turbines are made locally or in Cleveland with a supply chain, and the 3D printers, that we can find a market to manufacture those in the United States. And likewise on the technology front, and high tech, and I hope people will read Sridhar's chapter. There's this myth that high tech is kind of an outlier and is exceeding the rest of manufacturing, when the reality is the deepest trade deficit that we have in the manufacturing sector is in high technology products. And if you pull out your smartphones, which I know are supposed to be off, but if you pull them out, you will not find a Made in America smartphone. You will be able to after this year, because Motorola and Google announced they're making the Moto X in Fort Worth. You have Apple that will be manufacturing MacBook Pros in Austin, Texas. You have Lenovo building laptops now in North Carolina. Google's kind of crazy glass are made in the Bay Area. And so you have Tesla, which opened a manufacturing facility in the Bay Area as well. So obviously some people think there's reason for hope. And I wanted to ask the three of you, what's your biggest cause for optimism moving ahead?
Well, I'll tell a story. When I started exploring manufacturing, I started at a company in Silicon Valley called Bloom Energy, which makes fuel cells. And the guy who runs it, who was a former NASA engineer named K.R. Sridhar, took me around and he showed me his facility, and then we sat down. It was very cool stuff. And he said, the thing that upsets me is I want to make this in the United States and I won't be able to. And he was the one who said to me, and I said to him, why not wages? I believed in the myth of the Chinese way. And he looked at me like I was clinically insane. He said, wages have nothing to do with high-end manufacturing. But he is, in fact, going to be able to manufacture his fuel cells in the United States. He's building a factory in Delaware. And the reason he managed to pull it off is interesting. Delaware had a renewable energy standard. And he went to the governor of Delaware and he said, you haven't actually included fuel cells as an eligible technology. So there's no market in Delaware for fuel cells. If you'll make fuel cells eligible for Delaware's renewable energy standard, I'll build my factory in Delaware and make my fuel cells there. And he's doing that. Now, interestingly, he is being sued by the Delaware Tea Party on the grounds that this constitutes being too favorable to a corporation, which, if you consider Delaware, is somewhat amusing. But the fundamental fact is there is a certain part of the American system that wants to slow down innovation. There are always companies that benefit from a slow rate of change. What we have to understand is we need to turn over our capital stocks faster, we need to innovate faster, and to do that we have to work together. We have to stop viewing this as kind of a war and make it into a collaboration.
Carl, thank you for that. Irene, how about you?
I think
the
the thing that makes me most hopeful is that manufacturing is sexy again. I see it in my classes. I see people wanting to tinker. I see experimentation. And you get those pesky entrepreneurs in there, and you don't know where they're going to take innovation in the first place. And I'm very, very hopeful with that.
Sridhar, how about you?
I think at the end of the day, the entrepreneurship and innovation is in our collective DNA that I don't think any other country can compete on that regard, but we have, if we get some of the policy measures right, it's not just coming up with ideas, big ideas, that's not going to put food on the table. You got to make it, you got to create wealth. And even from the national security point of view, you rarely see soldiers fighting with patents, they kind of need other things, you got to mix them. So I think I had the reason for optimism is that there is now all the companies that jumped on the bandwagon went, offshore stuff, went to China and other countries. Now they're realizing some of the challenges with offshoring, and they're beginning to see value in bringing R&D and manufacturing together, especially in high tech. And also, I think I'm optimistic that I think that the support for manufacturing exists in Washington to some extent, if you can call it bipartisan. I think there are both sides beginning to realize it. So hopefully we can put the right policies and public-private partnerships in place.
So we're potentially at the cusp of something very big, and I think that characterizes my point of view as well, is that you have this alignment of the political support. You have politicians talking about this. You have President Obama outlined a goal of creating 1 million manufacturing jobs over the next 4 years that would kind of defy recent history and needs to obviously put policies into place. You have management consultants writing reports about why it's important to reshore work. You have the academic community, as Sridhar mentioned, talking about the rationale for aligning your innovation and your production with your customer base and how much that makes sense. And one thing to me was also the success of the auto rescue, which did not come without pain for a lot of people. But it showed that America is exceptionally competitive and innovative, and that if you have smart regulation, if you are able to have collaboration between labor, government, and business, you can make products that people want to buy, and you can rescue an industry. And that is what we've seen, but we have to make that transition from kind of emergency care manufacturing policy to one that is much more sustainable than that. And I want to thank Carl Pope, Irene Petrick, Sridhar Kota for your contributions in the chapters, and that will conclude this portion of the program.
So today at the City Club of Cleveland, we are listening to a Friday forum featuring a panel discussion on what we must do to ensure that American manufacturing remains competitive in a changing global economy. We're going to return to the panel of authors in just a moment for the traditional City Club questions, and we encourage you to formulate your questions now. Want to remind you that your questions should be brief and to the point. We welcome all of you here today, as well as those listening to WCPN 90.3 FM, WCLV, WTAM, or one of our many radio stations across the country. Our television broadcast partners are WVIZ, PBS, IdeaStream, and the television broadcasts of the City Club are made possible by Cleveland State University and PNC. Our live webcast is supported by the University of Akron. Next Friday, July 19th, the City Club welcomes the Honorable Tom Barrett, Mayor of Milwaukee, who will discuss the state of the Great Lakes. For more information about upcoming forums, to make a reservation, or to order CDs or DVDs of these programs, please refer to our website at cityclub.org. We welcome guests today at tables hosted by the Alliance for American Manufacturing, Magnet, the United Steelworkers, Baker Hostetler, Cuyahoga Community College, and WireNet. Thank you for your support. Today's program is also being presented in partnership with WireNet, as I said earlier. We're celebrating our 25th anniversary today, and the forum is sponsored by the Alliance for American Manufacturing. So thank you to the Alliance for their support. Today is the Herbert and Nettie Borstein Endowed Forum. It was made possible by a generous gift from the Borsteins, and we want to thank them for their support. So now I'd like to return to our speaker and our speakers for our traditional City Club answer to your questions. We welcome questions from everybody, including guests. And holding the microphone today is City Club Development Associate Michael Crimaldi, over here, and Program Director Carrie Miller. So first question, please.
Thank you for a very enlightening program. And my question goes to any member of the panel who wishes to reply. Pretty clear that government policy, which is not as astute and as reliable as it might be, is a constraint on the development of manufacturing. This is a theme of your remarks. But I take heart from Carl Pope's story about Delaware, because even as we see tremendous problems in Washington, gridlock and so on, we look at 50 states, all of which have the economic development message clearly in their heads, and they are all natural competitors with each other. How much should we be trying to back away from federal level policy changes, much as they may be desirable, and see how much we can accomplish by setting the states all to compete to nurture development?
I think that's a good question, and I would like to take the first crack of that, and some of you may want to as well. Right now, we do have a 50-state competition for manufacturing jobs, and often the result is a net loss of manufacturing jobs nationally because you have states pursuing policies to try to attract those jobs. And I would charitably characterize some of those efforts as not being very high road in their manner. And they, in some ways, encourage a race to the bottom. And some of the public officials that are encouraging this kind of poaching, I guess, are otherwise very free market governors, but when it comes to these types of policies, they understand that people respond to incentives. And so I think it's the absence of having a coordinated national strategy for manufacturing that creates this environment, which is not necessarily hospitable to a sustainable development of manufacturing. And that if you have a coordinated set of federal policies on tax on the workforce, on trade, on procurement, on innovation, and a number of other factors, it positions us all over the 50 states to better compete with countries around the world, all of whom, by the way, have a manufacturing strategy, whether it's a German strategy that's very high road or a Chinese strategy that's very mercantilist. What we have here is an absence of strategy, and I think that is I think that has harmed our efforts. I will say I'm not terribly optimistic that in this political environment we'll be able to make exceptional progress, but I think that we can make some steps forward because both parties do realize the importance of this issue.
Let me be slightly different because I actually think there are two areas in which the states can solve the biggest problems. One, workforce development. There is no reason that states, by investing in education and investing in the right kind of education, can't actually catch the American workforce up to the manufacturing needs of the 21st century. And the second is infrastructure. While federal financial backing is eventually going to be necessary, states could do a lot to improve their own infrastructure in that's a virtuous form of competition, I would argue, is when states start competing to have better technical education, better primary education, better advanced education, and they start competing for infrastructure. But there is a very peculiar thing about our politics. If you talk to conservatives in Washington, they are anathema on the topic of manufacturing policy. They hate the idea of manufacturing policy, of, as they put it, government picking winners and losers. If you talk to Republican governors, they talk about virtually nothing else except manufacturing policy. If you listen to Haley Barbour, who was the former governor of Mississippi and the former head of the Republican Party, and his standard speech about Mississippi is about Mississippi's manufacturing policy. Rick Perry, the governor of Texas, talks endlessly about his efforts to attract manufacturing to Texas. We have a very strange attitude. Manufacturing policy is good for Mississippi, it's good for Texas, it's good for Michigan, and it's bad for America. I don't think that can add up.
Yeah. If I can chime in, you're right on. There is definitely a role for federal government. And, historically for the last 100 years, if you look at from railroad to internet and everything in between, from computers, semiconductors, GPS, aircraft industry, all of this actually was enabled, we're transitioning. Of course, the great ideas came out of like Wright brothers and others, but you had the government has created infrastructure for designing and developing and testing and standards and what have you in all these cases, and also tied that with the government early procurement through Department of Defense. Defense alone buys over $200 billion of manufactured goods every year. So we've done this before very well on how we establish these huge industries through federal government investment. So the idea that somehow federal government get out of the way I think is misplaced. And hopefully we'll get through this gridlock in Washington and actually take the ideas what states are doing and apply it across federal government like we've done before.
One or another of you have commented on education, and I'd like you to dwell a little bit further on what changes we need to see in our secondary school programs to help equip young people for tomorrow's manufacturing jobs?
I imagine most of us have a thought on that. Let me offer one brief thing. I mean, we have in part because of the paucity of openings in manufacturing, the pipeline constricted, and because service providers respond to what the needs are in the jobs marketplace. But there have been consequences to that, and part of it is this idea. And the idea being that we're in a knowledge economy and every kid needs to get a 4-year college degree to be successful. And one of the side effects of that is that we have students who have enormous debt, who have not tremendous job opportunities coming out of 4 years of college. And we have not as many folks as there probably should be interested in manufacturing careers. So part of it is rebuilding vocational education, investing in it at that level, and instead of warehousing the kids who are not college prep, ensuring that they have an academy-like opportunity to learn hands-on skills as well as make progress in science, technology, engineering, math, and problem solving. And I think that there are lots of great local examples around the country of where that is happening, but they're more anecdotal than systemic at this point, and they need to be systemic.
So Scott, I'd like to build on that a little bit, because I think that the whole idea of problem solving, we see students coming into our classes out of high schools, and they really only know how to solve a problem if they've read it in a book, if they've actually seen the thing played out. They really don't have a sense of how do I do a solution, what does a solution look like. And part of the problem is that our secondary schools, elementary through secondary, are teaching to Regents exams, they're teaching to some kind of hurdles. We've got the wrong metrics in place, and if you have a No Child Left Behind policy, which was a well-intended policy, I won't say well executed, but well intended. The results are that we have students who can take a test but can't apply the knowledge. And we need a lot more hands-on kinds of activities. We need a lot more problem-solving activities, whether they go into manufacturing or elsewhere. This is a real challenge that we see. I'm sure you see the same thing.
Yeah, Sridhar, what do you see?
Well, I think a lot of these are well-intended, but even the STEM education focus we talk about, much of that is we teach on one hand in K through 12 science and math, which is very important, we should do that. But for those who are college bound, and of course we want everybody to go to college, not everybody wants to go to college, but then on the other hand, for those who are not, then we teach them trades to go and learn CNC machining or what have you. What we are missing, the innovation gap we have between science and manufacturing. You have an idea, you have a discovery, you have an invention. How do you turn that into a product that is safe and reliable and cost effective and what have you? There is something, a term for it, what you do, that it's called engineering. And we used to be very good at it. And not anymore. And this is where, we don't teach engineering in K through 12. And we have 4% of our high school graduates going into engineering in this country, compared to 10% just 50 miles from here in Canada, and 15% in Germany, and 25% in China. So that's
if we had a slogan, it would be to put the E back in STEM.
There you go.
Yeah,
that's right.
There we go.
Let me ask you, how many people here have fixed anything in the last week? Okay, I'm surprised actually, because it's very hard to fix things today, and we're losing a skill that people used to get by fixing things and watching their parents fix things at home.
That's a great point. Actually, we ask students to dissect a frog, which is a good thing. In high school, probably most of you did that. Why don't we ask them to take apart a power tool and see how it's made and why it's designed the way it's designed? And so kids used to grow up on the farm and take cars apart and fix them, but they don't do it anymore.
Hi, this is addressed to Carl, but please feel free. I'm wondering what a national energy policy might look like for our heavy industrial users and how we can incentivize something like that to happen.
Well, industry needs lots of power from diverse sources at an affordable cost without poisoning the communities where they produce. And we have the technologies to do that. And right now, frankly, with the relative abundance of both natural gas and light tight oil in the United States, we do not have to pay OPEC prices. And in fact, right now, we are not paying OPEC prices for oil and gas in the United States. We are about to throw that advantage away and lock ourselves into OPEC prices by exporting that oil and gas so that we can export oil and gas and import OPEC prices. But really, what manufacturing needs is a policy that says, hey, right now we have freed ourselves from the cartel. The oil cartel does not have its fingers around our throat. Let's keep it that way.
I want to add something quickly because I think this is important. Because of carbon pollution. Carbon pollution is not necessarily, it's not the source point that matters. It doesn't make a difference where it's being done in the world. It has a net effect globally. So reducing carbon pollution alone in the United States will have some impact, but if it's offset by increases in carbon pollution in China or other countries, the net effect is going to be not so good. And any policy has to recognize that as our industrial users are regulated and are seeking to reduce carbon pollution, that there be some what we call border adjustability. So, for instance, if a ton of steel coming in from China, which is made with 3 to 4 times the carbon pollution as you would emit in the United States, there has to be some way to capture that cost and either repurpose that funding towards renewable energy or do something else with it. But unless you have that border adjustable mechanism, if you're reducing production in the United States, if that's one of the impacts, it could well be encouraging production that's going to emit more carbon pollution somewhere else. That's why a border adjustable or some sort of a global solution is also necessary to this challenge.
Each of you today has had some very positive suggestions on how to improve and help the American economy. There is one long-standing negative, though, which reflects the fact that during the last 2 decades, so many manufacturers have taken their production overseas, mainly for economic reasons. Cleveland particularly has suffered. We once had a very prosperous clothing industry here, which employed literally thousands of people. All those jobs are now gone. And the question is, do you think there's some way that process can be reversed, perhaps by changing our tax policies or any other way? And if not, do you think that we have lost forever those types of jobs?
It's a great question. I'll give a very brief summary of my answer, which is actually answered in the chapter I write in the book, is how do you bring some of that production back? But it's this. Manufacturers, like anybody else, they're rational actors and they respond to incentives. And unless we have the right incentives in place, you will continue to see offshoring, regardless of whether it is clothing or if it's 3D printing. And it's the set of incentives that you have in place that does make a difference. Part of that is the tax code. Part of that is having a trade policy that's results-oriented rather than based on a philosophy. Free trade sounds great, but if you're conducting free trade with a country that has a manufacturing strategy and mercantilist practices, the net effect is not going to be a good one. And we seem to repeat these mistakes without changing our behavior. I think that there's the potential to change it now, but we need some pretty bold policy changes to make it possible. Any other thoughts on that?
If I can add to that, the low-cost, low-wage jobs that we lost, I don't think many of them are coming back. But there is plenty out there in high-value and high-tech products. And that's where I'm saying that we should stop bleeding the air. And we can build, you see, if you don't build the infrastructure and the knowledge and the skills here, and if you don't have, once you lose the supply chains, it doesn't matter what the taxes are going to be, what the labor is going to be. You will not be able to manufacture things in this country anymore. Like, for example, when Amazon wanted to make Kindle in this country, where the key enabling technology was from the Massachusetts company E-Ink, But they couldn't find a way to manufacture here, even if they wanted to, because all the supply chains for all the components that go into hard drive and the display and the battery, they were all in Asia. So it makes perfect sense to make it there. So the point is, we need to establish in the next emerging technologies that are coming down the pipeline, we need to establish the infrastructure and supply chains here. That's the only way we can keep manufacturing. And also, we need to have appropriate legislation that incentivizes manufacturing here and also disincentivizes manufacturing overseas.
Well, I want to ask Irene to jump in for a second.
Just very different take,
because, I mean, one of the predictions is that manufacturing is going to be disrupted from unlikely sources that are local, and some of these trends favor localization.
I'll put on my rose-colored glasses and my pointy-headed academic hat for a moment. I think that I worry that a lot of the policy discussion is how do we bring traditional manufacturing back. And I think the real question is what kind of policies do we need to lead into the next 10 or 20 years. And I think they're two very different sets of issues. You talk about the importance of manufacturing the 3D printers here. I think the bigger impact is going to be all the people who want to have a 3D printer in their garage or on their desk and make things for themselves, make things locally for people around them. You're going to see in manufacturing what happened in retail. We made all kinds of decisions based upon traditional bricks and mortar, and along comes Amazon and PayPal and eBay, and now we have a completely different way of doing commerce. And I think that the same kind of thing is going to happen here. Individuals, as much as legislators, are going to drive the way manufacturing develops.
And a lot of that mass customization is in some of these kind of trinkets or kind of lower-end things that were long ago offshore.
It is today.
Yeah.
It is today, but we can make prosthetics, we can make dental implants, we can do a lot of medical devices. People want to have things customized to their bodies, to their needs, and they want them delivered immediately and seamlessly. And, you know, the tools didn't exist until recently, and you're going to see a lot of developments around additive manufacturing that are going to put this into the hands of individuals.
Yeah.
Let me make a point. Low-wage jobs are low-wage because they're low productivity. And it is the nature of innovation to want to disrupt such jobs with higher productivity. The question isn't can we bring back jobs making leather the way they used to make leather in 15th century Morocco. I really don't think any of us want those kinds of jobs back. The question is, how do we develop technologies that enable us to have shoes that don't require that kind of filthy, degrading work? And how do we make sure that when that happens, and it may happen in your backyard, for example, with clothing. One of the big barriers to clothing is the traditional notion that you had to dye the cloth first before you did something with it. There are new technologies that enable you to imprint the pattern and the color on the clothing after it's made. And the advantage there is people want to have the color that's cool this week. Okay? That's going to come back to the United States.
I mean, one thing that we didn't touch on, but that's an important issue, are some of the other economic trends that are out there that may be favoring reshoring. Obviously, there's trade winds here, but when you look at rising wages in China, which is part of a result of the one-child policy and a relatively shrinking workforce there, you see the potential. You see more companies considering the total cost, the total landed cost of their investments that goes beyond just the labor costs, as all of you mentioned, to consider intellectual property, how aligned innovation and production can be to make last-minute changes, inventory control, mitigating risks in the supply chain that were exposed in things like the Japanese tsunami a few years ago. And so Boston Consulting as a group has estimated that there's a lot of different types of manufacturing that could be coming back to the United States that include fabricated metals, primary metals, wood products, chemicals, things that you would consider kind of old line manufacturing, but because of new processes, new advantages, have the potential to be reshored. So I think it's both the high tech, the things that we haven't even imagined yet, as Irene indicated and Carl just alluded to, but it's also we may have a cost advantage that allows us to reshore much more work than we ever thought possible. And I think we've reached the end of our allotted time here. And I once again want to thank the City Club of Cleveland. I want to thank Carl Pope, former executive director of the Sierra Club, Dr. Irene Petrick of Penn State, Dr. Sridhar Kota of the University of Michigan, and would encourage all of you listening out there as well to find our book online at ReMakingAmericaBook.com. Thanks again.
Today at the City Club, we've been listening to a Friday forum featuring a panel discussion with Sridhar Kota, Paul Scott, Irene Petrick, and Carl Pope. Thank you, panel, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen.